February 28, 1995, Fort Bragg, North Carolina. 10 elite Army Rangers lay motionless in the freezing waters of the swamp, their bodies scattered across a training ground that had become a death trap. They had started their exercise just hours earlier, a routine night navigation mission designed to test their skills. None of them expected it would be their last. The temperature had dropped to 32 degrees Fahrenheit, the water was 52 degrees, and these highly trained soldiers were about to become victims of a silent killer that no one saw coming. Rangers are the elite of the US Army, specially selected, rigorously trained warriors who pride themselves on completing any mission, no matter the cost. Their motto, "Rangers lead the way," isn't just a slogan, it's a promise written in blood across battlefields from Normandy to Afghanistan. Training for these elite soldiers is deliberately brutal. The philosophy is simple: the more you sweat in training, the less you bleed in combat. Rangers routinely push themselves beyond normal human limits, operating in extreme conditions that would break ordinary soldiers. They train in scorching deserts, freeze in Arctic conditions, and navigate treacherous mountains, because that's what the mission might demand. The path to earning the coveted Ranger tab is one of the military's most challenging journeys. Out of every 100 soldiers who attempt Ranger School, only about 36 complete it. The training pushes candidates to their absolute limits, and sometimes beyond. Sleep deprivation becomes a constant companion. Meals are scarce. Physical exhaustion is the norm. But Rangers embrace this hardship, knowing it forges the mental and physical toughness they'll need in combat. Fort Bragg's training grounds had long served as a crucible where Rangers proved their worth. The sprawling 251 square mile military installation features some of the most challenging terrain the Southeast has to offer. Dense forests, navigational challenges, and treacherous swamps create an environment that tests even the most seasoned soldiers. The swamps, in particular, had earned a fearsome reputation. Murky waters concealed sudden drop-offs. Thick vegetation could disorient even experienced navigators. Temperature changes could transform familiar terrain into deadly territory in a matter of hours. The 3rd Battalion of the 75th Ranger Regiment was considered among the best of the best. Their commanders prided themselves on maintaining the highest standards of training and combat readiness. The battalion had recently returned from deployment exercises in South Korea, where they had excelled in extreme cold weather operations. This experience, ironically, would later be cited as one reason their commanders felt confident about conducting the fateful night training exercise. Fort Bragg's swamps had claimed lives before. In 1988, 2 soldiers died during a similar training exercise when hypothermia set in faster than anyone expected. The investigation led to new safety protocols, mandatory buddy systems, improved communications equipment, and stricter weather monitoring. These changes were supposed to prevent future tragedies. But as time passed, the hard lessons learned began to fade. Staff Sergeant Norman Tillman embodied everything the Rangers stood for. At 28, he had already served multiple combat tours and earned a reputation as one of the most skilled instructors in the regiment. His soldiers respected him not just for his technical expertise, but for his ability to push them to achieve things they never thought possible. Tillman understood the delicate balance between challenging his Rangers and keeping them safe. The exercise plan for February 28th was part of the Rangers' Advanced Training Program, a series of increasingly complex missions designed to prepare soldiers for the unpredictable nature of modern warfare. The program had been developed in response to lessons learned from operations in Panama and the First Gulf War, where Rangers had to operate in diverse and challenging environments with minimal support. That night's mission would involve 4 12-man teams, each responsible for navigating to different objectives across the swampy terrain. The teams would carry standard combat loads, weapons, tactical gear, navigation tools, and minimal survival equipment. The weight of their gear, approximately 55 pounds per soldier, would make movement through the swamp even more challenging. The dangers of night navigation weren't theoretical for these men. Every Ranger knew stories of soldiers who had become disoriented in darkness, their compasses confused by the dense iron deposits common in Fort Bragg's soil. The swamps were particularly treacherous at night, when depth perception became nearly impossible and familiar landmarks disappeared into darkness. Preparation for the exercise had begun days earlier. Base meteorologists provided detailed weather forecasts, equipment was checked and rechecked, and medical protocols were reviewed. The battalion's medical team had set up aid stations at strategic points along the exercise route. Each was equipped to handle the typical injuries seen during swamp training: sprains, cuts, and minor cases of exposure. The Rangers themselves approached the exercise with their characteristic mix of professionalism and dark humor. Private First Class Michael Rodriguez, just 19 years old and 4 months out of Ranger School, joked with his teammates about alligators in the swamp. Staff Sergeant James Cooper, a veteran of 3 combat deployments, reminded his team about the importance of maintaining body heat in wet conditions, a lesson he'd learned the hard way during winter warfare training in Alaska. The exercise area spanned roughly 5 square miles of Fort Bragg's most challenging terrain. The swamp's water depth varied unpredictably from ankle deep to over 6 feet. Thick vegetation and muddy waters made movement slow and exhausting. Under normal conditions, Rangers could traverse this terrain in about 4 hours. At night, with full combat loads, the journey could take twice as long. Trainee accidents were an accepted risk in the Ranger community. The unofficial motto was "train as you fight," and Rangers took pride in pushing the boundaries of what was possible. Every year, dozens of Rangers suffered injuries during training: broken bones, hypothermia, heat exhaustion. These incidents were seen as the cost of maintaining the world's most elite light infantry force. But as Tillman briefed his teams that evening, something felt different. The weather reports showed a cold front moving in, nothing unusual for February in North Carolina. What Tillman didn't realize was that in just a few hours, this routine training mission would spiral into a sequence of fatal decisions that would haunt the US Army for decades to come. The hours leading up to the exercise were marked by a series of seemingly minor decisions that would later prove catastrophic. At 1500 hours, the base weather station issued an updated forecast. The cold front was intensifying. Temperatures were expected to drop into the low 30s, significantly colder than initially predicted. Standard protocol required a review of training conditions when temperatures fell below 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Battalion Commander Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison faced a choice. He could postpone the exercise or modify it to reduce cold weather risks. But the Rangers had trained in much worse conditions. Just 2 months earlier in South Korea, they had conducted exercises in temperatures below zero. Morrison approved the mission to proceed as planned. The next critical decision came at the equipment check. Standard cold weather gear, thermal underlayers, waterproof shells, and emergency warming equipment was available in the unit's supply room. But the exercise was designed to simulate combat conditions, where soldiers might not have access to specialized gear. The decision was made to stick with standard combat loads. Major Robert Hayes, the officer in charge of safety protocols, had spent the morning reviewing weather data and training parameters. His 15 years of experience told him something wasn't right. The combination of near-freezing air temperatures and cold water created conditions more dangerous than standard metrics suggested. When he measured the water temperature in the swamp, 52 degrees Fahrenheit, he knew immersion could cause hypothermia in under an hour. Hayes drafted a detailed memo recommending modifications to the exercise: increased safety checkpoints, mandatory exposure suits, and enhanced communication protocols. But changing the parameters would mean delaying the exercise by at least 24 hours to implement new safety measures. The battalion was already behind on its training schedule due to previous weather delays. His recommendations were noted but overruled. The ripple effects of overruling Hayes' recommendations would become tragically clear in the coming hours. In the post-incident investigation, investigators would discover that similar warnings had been dismissed 3 times in the past year. Each time, the Rangers completed their missions successfully, reinforcing a dangerous pattern of pushing the limits of safety protocols. The lack of consistent training standards for cold weather operations created another vulnerability. While the unit had extensive cold weather experience from their South Korea deployment, Those exercises had been conducted with proper winter warfare equipment and enhanced safety measures. This night's exercise would combine cold temperatures with water immersion, a far more dangerous scenario that required different safety considerations. The planned routes through the swamp had been used dozens of times before, but never under these specific conditions. Recent heavy rains have raised water levels in some areas by several feet, creating deep pools where rangers would be forced to swim rather than wade. No one had reassessed the routes to account for these changes. The communications plan created another potential weakness. To maintain radio silence and simulate combat conditions, teams would only check in at designated rally points. Emergency frequencies were established, but their use would result in automatic failure of the exercise. This protocol, designed to maintain training realism, would prove disastrous when teams began missing their checkpoints. The medical support plan seemed robust on paper. 3 aid stations were positioned around the training area, each staffed with combat medics and equipped with standard field treatment supplies. But they were designed to handle routine training injuries, sprains, cuts, minor cases of exposure. No one anticipated needing to treat multiple cases of severe hypothermia simultaneously. At 1800 hours, Staff Sergeant Tillman conducted the final briefing. Maps were distributed, routes were confirmed, and emergency procedures were reviewed. The Rangers were divided into their 4-man teams, each responsible for navigating to specific objectives across the swamp. The temperature had already dropped to 38 degrees. Private First Class Rodriguez pulled Tillman aside after the briefing. The young ranger mentioned feeling unusually cold. He'd been fighting a mild fever earlier in the day. Rangers prided themselves on pushing through discomfort, and Rodriguez insisted he was fit for duty. Tillman, remembering his own determination as a young ranger, made a decision that would haunt him. He allowed Rodriguez to join his team. At 1900 hours, as darkness settled over Fort Bragg, the first teams began moving out. The wind had picked up, driving the wind chill below freezing. Clouds obscured the moon, creating near total darkness. The Rangers disappeared into the swamp, each team taking different routes to their objectives. None of them realized they were walking into conditions that would soon turn lethal. As the teams made their way deeper into the swamp, the first signs of trouble were already emerging. And in the darkness and confusion of that February night, no one recognized them for what they were, the beginning of a cascade of events that would push human endurance beyond its limits. 2000 hours, the first signs that something was wrong came from Team Charlie. Their point man, Sergeant David Martinez, noticed his team was taking longer than expected to reach their first checkpoint. The thick mud of the swamp grabbed at their boots, each step requiring twice the normal effort. Their planned 45-minute movement to the first rally point had already taken over an hour. In Team Alpha, Private Rodriguez was struggling. The fever he'd been fighting earlier was getting worse, accelerating his body's heat loss in the freezing conditions. But Rangers don't quit. He pushed on, not wanting to let his team down. His team leader, noticing Rodriguez's sluggish movements, attributed it to normal fatigue from the difficult terrain. By 2100 hours, the temperature had dropped to 35 degrees. The wind cut through wet uniforms like a knife, but the real danger was in the water. Team Bravo had hit a deep section of swamp, forcing them to swim short distances between patches of solid ground. Each immersion sapped more of their body heat. The 52-degree water was steadily dropping their core temperatures, though none of them realized how dangerous it had become. Team Delta was the first to miss a checkpoint. Their planned route had become impassable due to unexpectedly deep water. They attempted to navigate around it. The detour in near-total darkness led them further off course. With radio silence protocols in effect, they had no way to report their situation without failing the exercise. Meanwhile, at the primary aid station, medical teams were growing increasingly concerned. Their calculations showed that even the fastest teams should have reached their first checkpoints by now. The standard procedure was to wait for the training cadre to request support. But as minutes ticked by with no radio contact, the lead medic, Sergeant Sarah Collins, felt increasingly uneasy. She had treated cold weather injuries before and knew how quickly conditions could deteriorate. The weather continued to worsen. The wind chill dropped to 25 degrees, and a light drizzle began to fall. For the Rangers already soaked from the swamp, this additional moisture would prove devastating. The combination of wet clothes, wind, and cold temperatures created the perfect conditions for rapid heat loss. 2200 hours. The situation deteriorated rapidly. In Team Charlie, 2 Rangers showed the first signs of hypothermia, confusion, slurred speech, and uncontrollable shivering. Their team leader, Staff Sergeant Wilson, faced a critical decision. Breaking radio silence meant automatic failure, but his men were in trouble. Pride and training protocol won out. They pressed on. Team Bravo's situation had become equally dire. Specialist Thomas Chen had lost sensation in his feet after multiple water crossings. The team's navigator, Lieutenant Michael Park, was showing signs of disorientation, struggling to read his compass. The temperature continued to drop, and their wet uniforms had become a deadly liability. Private Rodriguez collapsed at 22:30 hours. His team initially thought he had tripped in the darkness, but when they tried to help him up, they found him barely conscious. His wet uniform had accelerated his body's heat loss, and the fever had masked the early warning signs of hypothermia. Team Alpha finally broke radio silence, calling for emergency evacuation. The call shattered the exercise's communication blackout, triggering a cascade of revelations. Other teams began reporting their positions and conditions. The picture that emerged was dire. Across the training area, Rangers were struggling with various stages of cold weather injuries. The combination of wet clothes, freezing temperatures, and physical exertion had created perfect conditions for mass hypothermia. Back at the command post, the initial emergency call sparked frantic activity. Night vision equipment was rushed to staging areas. Thermal imaging helicopters were requested from nearby Pope Air Force Base. But the same darkness that had disoriented the Rangers would now hamper rescue efforts. The swamp that had been challenging to navigate during the exercise would become a maze of confusion for rescuers. At the operations center, Lieutenant Colonel Morrison received the first casualty reports with disbelief. His Rangers were among the Army's most elite soldiers, trained to operate in extreme conditions. How had a routine training exercise gone so catastrophically wrong? As he mobilized the rescue operation, he couldn't know that several of his men were already beyond help. The battalion's senior medical officer, Captain James Garcia, quickly recognized they were facing a mass casualty event. Standard hypothermia protocols called for immediate evacuation to a medical facility, but with teams scattered across 5 square miles of swamp, coordinating rescues would be complex. He ordered all 3 aid stations to prepare for multiple severe hypothermia cases. The base hospital was alerted to prepare their trauma center. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the emergency department chief, began mobilizing additional staff and equipment. She knew from experience that hypothermia patients could crash suddenly, their hearts becoming increasingly unstable as their core temperatures dropped. The hospital would need every available hand. But the true scale of the disaster was still unknown. As rescue teams scrambled to locate the scattered groups in the darkness, they would soon discover that some Rangers had already been in the water too long. The next few hours would become a desperate race against time, and not everyone would survive. 22:45 hours, the rescue operation launched into action with the urgency of a combat mission. 3 Black Hawk helicopters from Pope Air Force Base lifted off, their thermal imaging equipments scanning the dark swamp below. On the ground, teams of combat medics and ranger instructors began pushing into the training area from multiple entry points. The first rescue team reached Team Alpha at 2300 hours. They found Private Rodriguez unconscious, his core temperature dangerously low. 2 other team members showed advanced signs of hypothermia. The team's medic, Specialist Mark Thompson, began aggressive rewarming procedures, but Rodriguez's condition was critical. His wet uniform had to be cut away, replaced with thermal blankets, but the damage was already done. What Thompson saw alarmed him. Rodriguez's core temperature had dropped to 87 degrees. At this temperature, the heart becomes extremely vulnerable to arrhythmias. Every movement had to be gentle. Too much jostling could trigger cardiac arrest. As they prepared Rodriguez for evacuation, his pulse became increasingly erratic. Team Charlie's location remained unknown. Their last radio transmission, broken and garbled, suggested they were over a mile from their planned position. Staff Sergeant Wilson had tried to lead his team to higher ground, but 2 members could no longer walk. The hypothermia had progressed to the point where they were becoming irrational, trying to remove clothing, a dangerous symptom known as paradoxical undressing. At 23:15 hours, one of the Blackhawks spotted heat signatures in a particularly dense section of swamp. Team Bravo was found huddled together on a small island of solid ground, surrounded by deep water. Lieutenant Park was unconscious. Specialist Chen, despite having no feeling in his legs, had managed to keep Park's head above water for over an hour. The rescue itself posed new dangers. The helicopter crews couldn't risk landing in the swamp. They had to lower rescue baskets, hoping the hypothermic rangers had enough strength left to secure themselves. Some were so impaired they had to be physically strapped in by rescue team members who swam out to help. The hospital scene became increasingly chaotic as casualties arrived. Dr. Mitchell's team worked frantically to save those in critical condition. The hospital had never handled so many severe hypothermia cases simultaneously. Each patient required intensive care, careful rewarming, cardiac monitoring, and treatment for complications like fluid in the lungs. 23:30 hours. Team Delta remained missing. Their last known position was based on a garbled radio transmission from an hour earlier. The thermal imaging helicopters swept the area repeatedly, but the dense tree canopy made detection difficult. Time was running out. Captain Garcia established a forward aid station closer to the search area, knowing that when Team Delta was found, every minute would count. The medical team prepared for the worst, setting up cardiac monitors, warming blankets, and emergency resuscitation equipment. The night had already claimed several casualties. They were determined not to lose any more. The Rangers, who were still able to help, joined the search efforts, ignoring their own exhaustion and exposure. They knew the terrain better than anyone, and more importantly, they understood how a Ranger team would think under duress. Staff Sergeant Tillman led one of these search teams, the weight of his earlier decision about Rodriguez heavy on his mind. The temperature continued to drop. The light drizzle had turned to a cold rain, making the rescue operation even more challenging. Visibility was down to mere feet, and the sound of helicopter rotors and rescue teams calling out made it difficult to hear any responses from the missing team. At 23:45 hours, a breakthrough came. A rescue team found equipment that had been dropped by Team Delta, a compass and a partially shredded map. The items showed signs of confusion. The map had been folded incorrectly, suggesting the team had become disoriented. More worryingly, they found discarded clothing, a clear sign of advanced hypothermia. The base hospital continued receiving casualties. Dr. Mitchell's team worked with mechanical precision, but the cases were severe. 3 Rangers were in critical condition, their core temperatures so low that traditional rewarming methods weren't enough. The hospital initiated its mass casualty protocol, calling in additional staff and coordinating with nearby civilian trauma centers. The rescuers themselves began to suffer in the harsh conditions. Despite their protective gear, the cold rain and wind took their toll. Several had to be pulled back for signs of exposure, but they refused to give up. Every Ranger knew the unofficial motto: Rangers don't leave their own behind. Sergeant Collins, monitoring vital signs at the forward aid station, had treated hypothermia before, but never like this. The combination of cold water immersion and freezing rain had created hypothermia cases more severe than anything covered in their medical training. Some Rangers arrived with core temperatures so low their conditions defied conventional medical wisdom about survival. As the search for Team Delta continued into the early morning hours, the toll of the disaster began to become clear. The next 30 minutes would reveal the full human cost of what had started as a routine training exercise. The final toll was devastating. 10 Rangers lost their lives that night, the highest number of training-related fatalities in U.S. Army history. Private Rodriguez never regained consciousness, succumbing to cardiac complications from severe hypothermia. 2 members of Team Delta were found too late, their bodies recovered at dawn, only 200 yards from a designated extraction point. The investigation that followed revealed a systemic failure of safety protocols. Major Hayes' warnings about cold water conditions had been buried under layers of bureaucracy. The assumption that rangers could handle extreme conditions had created a dangerous culture of pushing beyond safe limits. Training records showed multiple near misses in previous exercises that had gone unreported. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison resigned his command. Staff Sergeant Tillman, though cleared of direct responsibility, left the Army soon after. The weight of his decision about Rodriguez proved too heavy to bear. He later became an advocate for military training safety reforms, testifying before Congress about the dangers of prioritizing toughness over safety. The families of the fallen Rangers refused to let their sons' deaths be in vain. They'd formed the Military Training Safety Foundation, lobbying for reforms and supporting families affected by training accidents. Their efforts led to the creation of the Training Fatality Review Board, an independent body with the power to investigate and halt unsafe training practices. The Army's response was swift and comprehensive. New cold weather training protocols were established, requiring specific gear for any exercise involving water immersion. The silent suffering culture that discouraged soldiers from reporting health issues was directly addressed. Medical screening before training exercises became mandatory. Each unit was required to establish a dedicated safety officer position, with direct access to command leadership. The Rangers Lead the Way motto took on new meaning. The disaster forced a fundamental shift in how the military viewed training safety. Leadership now emphasized that true toughness included the wisdom to recognize dangerous conditions and the courage to speak up about safety concerns. A memorial now stands at Fort Bragg, bearing the names of the 10 Rangers lost that night. Below their names is inscribed, "They gave their lives not in combat with a foreign enemy, but in preparation to defend their nation." Their sacrifice reminds us that every training decision carries the weight of human life. The investigation's findings led to the creation of the 4 Pillars of Training Safety, a comprehensive framework now used across all military branches. The pillars, risk assessment, environmental monitoring, medical readiness, and command responsibility, became the foundation for all military training operations. Each pillar represented a critical failure point from the Fort Bragg disaster. Every February, Rangers gather at the memorial for a remembrance ceremony. The tradition includes a safety stand-down day, where units review training protocols and discuss the lessons learned from the tragedy. Senior instructors share their personal connections to the event, ensuring that new generations of Rangers understand its significance. The term preventable training death entered military vocabulary. Every officer candidate now studies the Fort Bragg disaster as a case study in leadership failure. The lesson is clear. The drive to create tough, resilient soldiers must be balanced against the real physical limits of human endurance. Sergeant Sarah Collins, the medic who treated the first hypothermia casualties that night, went on to develop new cold weather medical protocols for the Army. Her experience treating multiple severe hypothermia cases led to improved guidelines for field treatment of cold weather injuries. The Collins Protocol for treating hypothermia in tactical environments became standard across all military branches. The disaster also led to technological innovations in military training safety. New environmental monitoring systems were developed, providing real-time data on conditions that could affect soldier safety. Advanced emergency communication systems were implemented, ensuring that no training exercise would ever again be compromised by communication protocols. Today, more than 2 decades later, the impact of that tragic night continues to influence military training worldwide. The lessons learned at Fort Bragg have saved countless lives, proving that sometimes the most important victories come from learning from defeat. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing.